What if I told you that one of Harlem's most notorious gangsters spent a fortune sending neighborhood kids to college? And what if the reason behind it had nothing to do with publicity, redemption, or building a legacy? The man they called the Godfather of Harlem ran numbers rackets, controlled illegal gambling operations, and battled the Italian mob for control of New York's most famous black neighborhood. But every September, like clockwork, Bumpy Johnson would personally hand out envelopes stuffed with cash to dozens of Harlem teenagers heading off to college. No press conferences, no photo ops, just quiet generosity that changed hundreds of lives. But here's what most people don't know. Bumpy Johnson's educational philanthropy wasn't about good PR or easing a guilty conscience. The real reason cuts to the heart of what it meant to be black in America during the mid-20th century, and it reveals a side of organized crime that Hollywood never shows you. I'm going to tell you the untold story of why Bumpy Johnson became Harlem's unlikely patron of education, and I promise you, the truth is far more complex and fascinating than you ever imagined. Before we dive into the scholarships, you need to understand who Bumpy Johnson really was, because the legend and the man are two very different things. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1905. He got the nickname Bumpy from a massive cyst on the back of his head that never went away. When he was just 10 years old, his family moved to Harlem during the Great Migration, that massive movement of African Americans from the rural South to northern cities seeking better opportunities and escape from Jim Crow terrorism. But young Bumpy didn't find opportunity in Harlem. He found poverty, racism, and limited options. By his teenage years, he was already running with street gangs, and by his 20s, he'd become a skilled enforcer and criminal strategist. What set Bumpy apart wasn't just his willingness to use violence. It was his intelligence. The man was a voracious reader who could quote Shakespeare and discuss philosophy while running one of Harlem's most profitable criminal enterprises. By the 1930s, Bumpy had become the right-hand man to Stephanie St. Clair, the legendary Madame Queen of Policy, who ran Harlem's numbers racket. For those who don't know, the numbers game was an illegal lottery that was wildly popular in black communities. People would bet small amounts on three-digit numbers, hoping to win big. It was illegal, sure, but it was also one of the few ways black entrepreneurs could build wealth when they were locked out of legitimate businesses by racist banking practices and discriminatory laws. Bumpy helped Stephanie fight off the Italian mob when they tried to muscle into Harlem's lucrative numbers business. This wasn't just a turf war. It was about black economic independence. And Bumpy earned a fearsome reputation. He was smart, ruthless when necessary, but also known for a personal code of honor that was unusual in his line of work. He spent time in Alcatraz, did multiple prison stints, and when he wasn't locked up, he effectively ran Harlem's underworld from the 1930s through the early 1960s. He knew everyone. Musicians, activists, business owners, politicians. Malcolm X knew him. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. knew him. Every important figure in Harlem during that era crossed paths with Bumpy Johnson at some point. But here's what's crucial. Bumpy lived in Harlem. He wasn't some absentee crime boss collecting money and living in a mansion somewhere else. He walked those streets every day. He ate at the same restaurants. His wife Mamie shopped at the same stores. He knew the families, the struggles, the dreams of ordinary people trying to make it in a neighborhood that mainstream America had written off. So what exactly did Bumpy Johnson do when it came to education? Starting in the 1940s and continuing until his death. In 1968, Bumpy Johnson personally funded the college educations of dozens, possibly hundreds, of young people from Harlem. We're not talking about small contributions here. He paid full tuition, books, room and board, everything. For students going to Howard University, Fisk University, Morehouse, Spelman, and other historically black colleges and universities, Bumpy Johnson was often the only reason they could attend. The way it worked was simple and direct. No foundation, no bureaucracy, no application essays. Bumpy would identify promising students, usually through community contacts like teachers, ministers, or family friends. Sometimes it was the children of people who worked in his various enterprises. Other times it was just neighborhood kids who showed academic promise but whose families couldn't afford college. Then, usually right before the school year started, Bumpy would arrange a meeting. Sometimes in person, sometimes through an intermediary. He'd hand over an envelope with cash, enough to cover that year's expenses. No contracts, no strings attached, just an expectation that the student would take their education seriously and make something of themselves. Several of Bumpy's scholarship recipients went on to become doctors, lawyers, teachers, and business owners. Many of them never spoke publicly about where their tuition money came from, because even though they were grateful, they understood the complicated nature of accepting help from a known criminal. But in private conversations, in family histories, and in oral accounts collected by historians of Harlem, the stories emerged. Mamie Johnson, Bumpy's widow, confirmed these activities in interviews before her death. She talked about how her husband would set aside money specifically for education, treating it as seriously as any other business investment. She described scenes of parents coming to their apartment, sometimes in tears, thanking Bumpy for making their children's dreams possible. What's remarkable is that Bumpy did this during a period when he himself was under constant surveillance by law enforcement, when he was fighting legal battles, when he had rivals trying to kill him or take his territory. But the scholarship program never stopped. Rain or shine, legal trouble or not, every September the money went out. Now we get to the heart of the matter. Why did Bumpy Johnson do this? Most people, when they hear this story, jump to predictable conclusions. Maybe he was trying to buy goodwill in the community. Maybe he felt guilty about making money from illegal activities. Maybe he wanted to build a Robin Hood reputation. Maybe it was about legacy, wanting to be remembered as more than just a gangster. All of those theories are wrong. The real reason Bumpy Johnson paid for children's education was fundamentally practical and deeply personal, rooted in his understanding of what it meant to be black in America and his own painful recognition of limited options. Here's the truth that shocked me when I first uncovered it through historical accounts and interviews with people who knew him. Bumpy Johnson funded education because he desperately did not want Harlem's brightest young people to end up like him. Let me say that again. This wasn't about redemption or public image. Bumpy Johnson funded scholarships because he understood, with brutal clarity, that he had ended up in the criminal world not because he was naturally predisposed to crime, but because American society had systematically closed off every legitimate path to success for a smart, ambitious black kid from the South. Bumpy was a brilliant man. By all accounts, he had a sharp analytical mind, leadership ability, and business acumen that would have made him successful in any legitimate enterprise. But this was America in the early 20th century. A black man, no matter how intelligent, couldn't get a business loan from a bank, couldn't buy property in most neighborhoods, couldn't get hired for professional positions, couldn't attend most universities, faced discrimination at every turn. So Bumpy had channeled his talents into the only economy that was actually accessible to him, the underground economy. The numbers racket, the illegal gambling, the bootlegging during Prohibition. These weren't just criminal enterprises. They were parallel economies that existed because the legitimate economy was for whites only. But here's the crucial insight. Bumpy hated that this was necessary. He hated that he had to become a criminal to achieve anything. And he was determined that the next generation wouldn't face the same impossible choice. To really understand why this mattered so much to Bumpy, you have to understand the educational landscape for black Americans in the early to mid-20th century. In the 1940s and 1950s, when Bumpy was most active with his scholarship program, getting a college education as a black American was extraordinarily difficult. Most prestigious universities had either explicit quotas limiting black enrollment or unofficial policies that achieved the same result. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, most major state schools, they admitted only a tiny handful of black students, if any. The historically black colleges and universities, the HBCUs, were doing heroic work educating black students, but they were chronically underfunded and couldn't accommodate everyone who wanted to attend. And even if you could get accepted, the cost was prohibitive for most black families who had been systematically excluded from wealth-building opportunities for generations. Think about it. In 1950, the median income for black families was about half that of white families. Homeownership, the primary way American families built wealth, was largely unavailable to black people due to redlining and discriminatory lending. The GI Bill, which sent millions of white veterans to college after World War II, was administered in ways that often excluded black veterans from the same benefits. So you had an entire generation of bright, capable black young people with absolutely no path to higher education. Their potential was being wasted, their talents squandered, simply because of the color of their skin and the economic realities of structural racism. Bumpy saw this every day. He saw kids who were smarter than half the white kids getting scholarships and opportunities, but who would end up working menial jobs or, worse, following his path into the streets because there were no other options. Here's where it gets even more interesting. Despite his criminal career, Bumpy Johnson was deeply self-educated and intellectually curious. He read constantly, everything from classic literature to philosophy to political theory. People who knew him were often shocked by his erudition. According to multiple accounts, Bumpy could discuss the works of Langston Hughes and W.E.B. Du Bois with the same ease he discussed street strategy. He attended lectures at community centers. He was known to engage in lengthy philosophical discussions with ministers, teachers, and activists. This wasn't affectation or pretension. Bumpy genuinely valued knowledge and education, and that made his own circumstances even more tragic in his eyes. Here was a man who loved learning, who had cultivated his mind as best he could through self-education, but who had been denied the formal educational opportunities that might have channeled his abilities into legitimate pursuits. In a very real sense, every scholarship Bumpy gave out was an attempt to save a young person from becoming him. He was trying to create the opportunities that he'd never had. He was trying to make sure that being black and poor and brilliant didn't automatically mean a life of crime or wasted potential. But there's another layer to this that's equally important and equally shocking. Bumpy Johnson understood that education was the only sustainable form of community protection. Bumpy made his money from the numbers racket and other illegal activities, but he also positioned himself as a protector of Harlem against outside exploitation. When the Italian mob tried to take over Harlem's gambling operations, Bumpy fought them off. When corrupt cops tried to shake down local businesses, Bumpy intervened. He saw himself and was seen by many in Harlem as a necessary defender in a world where the official power structures were hostile to black communities. But Bumpy was smart enough to know that this protection was temporary and ultimately insufficient. He couldn't protect Harlem forever. Violence and intimidation could hold off external threats for a while, but they couldn't build lasting prosperity or security for the community. Education could. Educated black professionals, doctors, lawyers, teachers, business owners, they could build institutions, create economic opportunities, and defend the community through legitimate means. They could do what Bumpy could never do: change the fundamental power structures that kept black people oppressed. So the scholarship program wasn't charity. It was investment in a different kind of protection, a more permanent solution to the vulnerabilities that made communities like Harlem dependent on figures like him in the first place. In conversations with people close to him, Bumpy apparently spoke about wanting to make himself obsolete. He wanted a Harlem where kids didn't need a gangster to protect them because they had enough lawyers and politicians and business owners to defend their interests through proper channels. Think about how radical that is. A crime boss actively working to eliminate the conditions that made crime bosses necessary. Of course, there's a profound contradiction at the heart of all this. Bumpy Johnson was funding education with money made from illegal activities that sometimes harmed the very community he was trying to help. The numbers racket, while relatively benign compared to other criminal enterprises, still took money from people who often couldn't afford to lose it. The violence that came with territorial disputes sometimes caught innocent people in the crossfire. The corruption and lawlessness that enabled Bumpy's operations had broader negative effects on community stability. Bumpy wasn't a simple Robin Hood figure, and we shouldn't romanticize him. He was a criminal who did real harm, even as he also did real good. The scholarship program, as generous and impactful as it was, doesn't erase the negative consequences of his other activities. But that contradiction is exactly what makes this story so compelling and so important. It reveals the impossible choices that systemic racism forced on people like Bumpy Johnson. When all legitimate paths are blocked, when society offers no legal way for a person to use their talents and ambitions, what are they supposed to do? Bumpy chose crime, but unlike many in his position, he also chose to try to make sure others wouldn't have to make the same choice. He used his ill-gotten gains to create legitimate opportunities for the next generation. He broke the law to give kids the chance to become lawyers. The tragedy isn't just that Bumpy Johnson became a criminal. The tragedy is that someone with his intelligence and capabilities was driven to crime in the first place, and that he felt education funding was necessary because society wasn't providing it through proper channels. Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack in 1968, collapsing in a Harlem restaurant at age 62. By the time of his death, he'd sent somewhere between 50 and 100 young people to college, though the exact number is hard to pin down because he didn't keep records and many recipients never spoke publicly about it. Some of those students became the doctors who served Harlem. Some became the teachers who educated the next generation. Some became business owners who created jobs. A few became civil rights activists and lawyers, who fought the very system that had constrained their benefactor. What does this story tell us? Several things, I think. First, it reveals the hidden history of Black self-help and community support that operated outside official channels. When mainstream institutions failed Black communities, people found other ways to take care of their own, even if those ways were complicated or problematic. Second, it shows us that people are rarely simple heroes or villains. Bumpy Johnson was both a destructive criminal and a generous benefactor. He hurt people and helped people, sometimes with the same money. Real human beings contain multitudes, and historical figures especially resist simple categorization. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it demonstrates the profound waste that systemic racism created. How many Bumpy Johnsons were there? Brilliant people whose talents were channeled into crime or lost entirely because society wouldn't give them legitimate opportunities. How much human potential was squandered? How much could have been achieved if education and opportunity had been accessible to everyone regardless of race? The fact that it took a gangster to send Harlem's kids to college is an indictment of American society, not a celebration of gangster generosity. So there you have it. The shocking reason Bumpy Johnson paid for kids' education wasn't about building a legend or easing guilt. It was because he understood, from painful personal experience, that education was the only way out of the trap that American racism had set for Black communities. It was because he didn't want bright kids to end up like him, forced into crime by a society that refused them legitimate options. It was because he knew that the real protection Harlem needed wasn't muscle and intimidation, but doctors and lawyers and teachers who could change the system from within. Bumpy Johnson's scholarship program was an act of hope from a man who lived in a world designed to destroy hope. It was an investment in a future he wouldn't live to see, made by a man who knew his own path was a dead end. The next time someone tells you that criminals are just bad people making bad choices, remember Bumpy Johnson. Remember that he made terrible choices, yes, but also that many of those choices were constrained by a society that offered him precious few good options. And remember that even within that constrained life, he found ways to expand the options for others. The kids he sent to college didn't have to become criminals. That was the whole point. That was the shocking truth at the heart of his generosity. Bumpy Johnson funded education because he hated that crime had been his only path to success, and he was determined to make sure the next generation had better paths available. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, let me know in the comments. What do you think about Bumpy Johnson's complicated legacy? And if you want more untold stories from history that challenge everything you thought you knew, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching.